Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you are here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa starting on page 421.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. Enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Marcus Garvey, Pan-Negroist, The View from Whitehall, an article published in Race Magazine, 1968, The Institute of Race Relations, London, by Robert G. Weisbord. Greetings, Koku. How are you tonight? Thanks for tuning in. Future historians may well view Marcus Mosiah Garvey as the central figure in 20th century Negro history. Some students of America's SEME record of race relations do not to mention countless ghetto militants, already regard Garvey as the patron saint of Black nationalism and the progenitor of Black power. More than any other Black leader, the charismatic Garvey, in his worldwide activities, underlined the international character of the color problem. He was a pan-Negroist without equal. During his era, Great Britain could still boast of an empire containing a sizable number of 400 million colored people, for whom Garvey was the self-proclaimed leader. Therefore, Whitehall's concern with Garvey, especially in his heyday, is not at all surprising. The depth and scope of that concern have not been fully understood. Fortunately, pertinent Foreign Office and Colonial Office documents, until recently inaccessible by scholars, are now open for examination at the Public Record Office in London. Dispatches from embassies, legations, and consulates on at least 3 continents repeatedly touched on the threat posed by Garvey and his local followers during the years of his American period, which was from 1916 to 1927. A document recently discovered in America's National Archives reveals that in 1919, unrest among Negroes in the United States and elsewhere was being closely watched by the British government. In that year, a strictly confidential report was sent to the Department of State listing groups important to radical Negro movements and providing notes on individual Black agitators and propagandists. To be sure, Garvey's influence was greater in West Africa than in East Africa, and in 1923, there were rumors that the Black Moses was planning a sojourn to the land of his fathers. The acting governor of Nigeria was of the opinion that Garvey should be refused a passport to visit that colony, and the majority of the Executive Council of Sierra Leone strongly believed that he should not be permitted to land at Freetown. In a letter dated May 28, 1923, the colonial secretary, the Duke of Devonshire, the acting governor of Sierra Leone, stated that Garvey appeared to advocate an open repudiation of obedience to the established European governments in Africa, accompanied with violent abuse of them. He described Garvey's views as mischievous and seditious. The Negro world, though not absolutely prohibited in Sierra Leone, had been carefully regulated. To support his description, the acting governor cited an ominous article in that newspaper. And it goes, "When it comes to Africa, we feel that the Negro has no obligation to anyone but himself. Whatsoever kind of government we have in Africa has been imposed on us by stealth and deception. Therefore, we are not compelled to recognize them. If it takes 1,000 years, we shall work for and probably fight for the freedom of our fatherland." It is interesting to note that the UNIA adherents from Sierra Leone had been active not only in their native land, but also in the neighboring Senegal. They were instrumental in setting up branches in Dakar, Rufisque, and Thies, and widely disseminating information about Garvey's program, and in collecting subscriptions for his schemes. After nervously scrutinizing the UNIA's activities for some months, the French authorities had, in 1922, deported some of the Sierra Leoneans in question. To the British Consul General in Dakar, the French move presented a curious spectacle of the UNIA, presumably an anti-European movement originating in the United States, indulgently tolerated in 4 British colonies and sternly repressed in 11 French dependencies. In 1920, Garvey dispatched Eli Garcia to consult the Liberian government about colonization possibilities for the New World Negroes. The UNIA promised to do everything possible to help Liberia liquidate its debts to foreign governments. On June 14th, Edwin Barclay, Secretary of State, writing to Garcia at the behest of President Charles D.B. King, stated that his government, appreciating as they do the aims of your organization as outlined by you, have no hesitancy in assuring you that they will afford the association every facility legally possible in effectuating in Liberia its industrial, agricultural, and business projects. So it sounds like they were not interested in the pan-Negroism, just in these economic schemes. In March of that same year, he had been even more specific when he told the UNIA officials that his government would be glad to have your association occupy certain settlements already laid out. On the strength of these commitments and others made by Mayor Johnson, early in 1924, 3 reportedly well-financed representatives of the UNIA arrived in Liberia to propose a settlement scheme involving 3,000 Blacks. The plan was allegedly to establish 6 communities, 2 on the British border and 4 on the French frontier. According to the British Charge of Affairs, Francis O'Meara, President King did actually offer a trial concession of 500 acres, but not in the areas desired by the UNIA. According to Garvey, the delegation had been successful in having a committee formed to receive the repatriated Negroes due to arrive later in 1924. That committee consisted of influential Liberians. The initial settlement was to be established near Cape Palmas on the Cavella River in Maryland County. While not satisfied on a number of points, the UNIA instituted a campaign to raise $2 million to construct the first colony. But in mid-year, when the rumor was bruited about in Liberia to the effect that 3,000 disciples of Marcus Garvey would be departing for Monrovia in November, the government abruptly reversed its decision. Barclay, in a letter to Monsignors Elder Dempster and Company Limited, shipping agents, stated categorically that no member of the Garvey movement would be allowed to enter the country. Steamship companies received the same notification. British officials were delighted, to say the least. When 3 followers of Garvey did actually disembark on July 25th, they were immediately placed under police guard and deported in short order. Later in the year, after the deportation of Reginald C. Hurley, a Barbadian with Garveyite leanings, the Charge became alarmed over the possibility of other British subjects would enter Sierra Leone as a result of expulsion from Liberia. In October, O'Meara was instructed by cipher telegram to forewarn the governor of any British colony to which deportation of UNIA personnel might be contemplated. President King, in his message to the legislature of Liberia, delivered on December 9, 1924, dealt with the Garveyite problem in extremely strong terms. He stated that the apparent intention of the UNIA was to use Liberia as a base for the dissemination of its propaganda of racial hatred and ill will. The president was particularly disturbed by the loud and continued boasts of members of that association in America, to the effect that they had obtained a firm foothold in Liberia and that the republic would be used as a point d'appui whence the grandiose schemes of their leader would be launched. Therefore, it was necessary for the government to take such steps as would show our friendly territorial neighbors and the world at large that Liberia was not in any way associated or in sympathy with any movement, which tends to intensify racial feelings of hatred and ill will. President King proceeded to denounce political incendiarism, whether Negro or not, and asserted that the objective of his country was not racialism, but nationalism. Negroes in the United States who desired to settle in the Republic and were unwilling to take an oath of exclusive allegiance to Liberia would be heartily welcome. However, and there can be no doubt that King was talking about Garvey here, Liberia's doors would be securely closed to a movement which planned to launch a race war against friendly states in Africa. Early in January 1925, when the Liberian president visited Sierra Leone, the governor of that colony applauded his statesmanship by saying, "Your Excellency, by slamming the door on spurious patriots from across the Atlantic, men who sought to make Liberia a focus for racial animosity on this continent, deservedly earned the gratitude not only of every West African government, but of all who have the true welfare of the African at heart." Edmund Cronin, in his classic Black Moses, explains Liberia's volte-face by alluding to the Liberian news, which averred that both Britain and France coveted the country and Garveyism would promote a convenient excuse for partition. Cronin also commented that the contents of the Garcia report, so disparaging about the Americo-Liberians, the most despicable element in Liberia, had become known to the government. It is also noteworthy that shortly after Liberia unequivocally disavowed the Garveyite program, an agreement was concluded with the Firestone Rubber Company. Some of the same territory earmarked for the development by the UNIA was leased to Firestone for rubber exploitation. At the time he carried out his research, which was 1950 to 1951, Cronin could not determine the extent to which England had instigated the Liberian rejection of Garvey. Relevant British official records were closed to him under the 50-year rule. Now open for inspection, they do not indicate that Britain played any active role. To offset UNIA propaganda, representatives of the British government in the United States did help to finance a new magazine called the British West Indian Review. It was hoped that the publication would affect the interest of West Indians residing in New York, a group which was drawn to the Garvey Crusade. The Consul General even assisted in the preparation of the first number of the magazine, which appeared in April of 1923. Generally, it may be said that as apprehensive as the British were about the destructive impact that Garvey might have on the empire, they felt that the United States government was chiefly responsible for him within its borders. The UNIA activities in British colonies or countries where British interests were vitally involved were another matter. Garvey's Negro World was banned in many dependencies, and members of the UNIA were denied entry into others. Just days after Garvey was convicted in June of 1923 for using the mails to defraud investors in the Black Star Line, the Foreign Office began to predict his moves after imprisonment. If, after the expiration of his term, Garvey applied for a passport to travel to any British West African colonies, facilities were not to be granted. Ironically, Garvey, the passionate apostle of back to Africanism, never did set foot on African soil. Garvey would doubtlessly have been amused by the way in which British officials impunged his movements. One minuted in 1923 that it is more than suspected that Garvey's efforts are not without considerable financial profit to himself and his immediate associates. As previously mentioned, the governor of British Honduras saw Germany as the evil force behind Garveyism. Others claimed that the UNIA was linked with the Wobblies, the international workers of the world. In the judgment of one observer, Garvey's newspaper attacked Britain with malignity reminiscent of the Irish World, which was another newspaper. Clearly, Negro World malignantly was no greater than that of an official who lamented in 1924 about Garvey, saying, "It's a pity the cannibals do not get a hold of this man." Die-hard championships of the erstwhile British Empire might well share those intemperate sentiments, for the reverberations of Garveyism are still being felt. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, putative leader of the Mau Mau and today president of an independent Kenya, once related to C.L.R. James how in 1921, Kenyan nationalists unable to read would gather around a reader of Garvey's newspaper, The Negro World, and listen to an article 2 or 3 times. Then they would run various ways through the forest, carefully to repeat the whole which they had memorized, to Africans hungry for some doctrine which lifted them from the servile consciousness in which Africans live. On the eve of independence, Kwame Nkrumah acknowledged Ghana's debt to Marcus Garvey, and in his autobiography, Nkrumah stated that Garvey's philosophies and opinions did more to fire his enthusiasm than any other book. James Coleman, in his book, Nigeria, Background to Nationalism, has written that many themes in the latter-day Nigerian nationalism have been cast in the spirit, if not in the exact words, of Garvey. Garveyite ideas deeply impressed Nigerians who were involved in proto-nationalistic organizations such as the Nigerian Youth Movement and the National Congress of British West Africa. 10 years after his death, the Kingston Gleaner stated, "It would be true to say of Jamaica, and to a lesser extent of the British West Indies, that national consciousness received its main impetus, if not was actually born, from the racial movement associated with the still revered Marcus Garvey." Fittingly, a bust of Garvey now graces King George VI Memorial Park in Kensington, and a thoroughfare is named in his honor. His remains were disinterred and taken to Jamaica in 1964. Today, in England itself, Garvey is lauded, even deified by Black power advocates from the West Indies and Africa. In a very real sense, as far as the British Empire is concerned, Garveyism has triumphed. Whitehall had good reason to be worried. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight? Some Aspects of the Political Ideas of Marcus Garvey by Tony Martin. The political ideas of Marcus Garvey contained all the classic elements of success. They were sophisticated and complex and based upon wide practical experience and deep study. Yet in their main essentials, they could be expounded simply enough to be easily grasped by the mass of oppressed Black people. Upon these ideas were built the most successful Pan-African organization in the history of the race. And as we of the present generation continue the historic quest for the liberation of our people, a close examination of the ideas of Garvey must of necessity repay the effort. Central to Garvey's ideas was the concept of God. This is an aspect of Garveyism which sits uneasily on the consciousness of the present generation. Thus, Garvey's motto, "One God, one aim, one destiny," is nowadays rendered, "One people, one aim, one destiny." There is nothing necessarily wrong with this change, and it probably faithfully represents a well-founded disenchantment with Christian religion based on the experience of centuries. This apparent departure from an important tenet of Garveyism is, however, less of a departure from the original use of the concept of God in Garveyism than would appear at first sight. For Garvey was also an avowed enemy of the institutional church, but faced with the overwhelming importance of God and religion in the lives of Black people, and mindful of his own familiarity with the Christian religion, he seems to have preferred to use the idea of religion while skillfully reinterpreting it for the use as an agent of liberation. In other words, faced with the choice of launching a frontal assault against religion on the one hand and co-opting it for the struggle of nationhood on the other, he preferred the latter. By this stratagem, he was presented with a ready-made vehicle which was already familiar to potential Garveyites. The God of Garveyism did not have too much in common with the God of the rest of Christendom. The God of Isaac and Jacob was cool for those who believed in Isaac and Jacob. He expounded, but God for Garveyites was the God of Africa, great and almighty. Furthermore, as Garvey explained, whilst our God has no color, yet it is human to see everything through one's own spectacles. He was therefore a black God. Furthermore, the God of Garvey was a God of self-reliance. Instead of telling Black people to be meek and mild, he told them that they would have to sacrifice and struggle for their freedom or perish. Garvey was fond of quoting Napoleon to the effect that God is on the side of the stronger battalion. The God of Garvey preoccupied himself with the spiritual side of man's dual nature. He would not presume to interfere in the affairs of men's bodies. As Garvey summed it up in 1937, at the same time taking a sly dig at Father Divine, he says, "We are not going to get it, freedom, by worrying God about it, because he is not a political agent of anybody. He is not a surveyor. God has given you the character to get anything you want without playing God. And there's only one man playing God, and that is Father Divine. We are not going to play God. We are just going to play man. What man has done, we are going to do." Later, that same year at the UNIA convention in Toronto, Garvey explained that while he was a believer in religion when it is delivered in the proper way, he was nevertheless not an advocate of religion. "I," he said, "have selected the job to save the bodies of men because I believe it's necessary to save the body and the soul. And if God didn't intend that, he never would have made man with a body." Garvey's theory of the separation of functions between God and man led logically to a ruthless advocacy of social Darwinism. His whole attitude to liberation could be summed up in a sentence from an issue of The Black Man of 1938. "It is a crime to be a fool." And since it was a crime to be a fool, then Black people who preferred to live in ignorance rather than bestir themselves could not justifiably blame the white man for their woes. Garvey may appear to some to have overstated this point, but it is a point which was always to be overstated to shake oppressed people out of the lethargy of subjugation. The doctrine of self-reliance inevitably emerged as the criterion by which Garvey judged other leaders of the race. Thus, although he certainly did not agree with every aspect of Booker T. Washington's program, he did consider the UNIA as a continuation, on a higher level, of some positive aspects of Washington's program. Indeed, he went further and asserted that no one since Washington, except of course for the UNIA, had come up with a positive and practical uplift program for the masses, North or South. His admiration for the self-help aspects of Washington's philosophy were matched by a depreciation of the dependence on white liberal sustenance, as characterized at the time by W.E.B. Du Bois. In Du Bois, he saw a Black man who had been educated and sustained by white philanthropy. He went so far as to suggest that if Du Bois and Garvey could both start from scratch again, Garvey would inevitably outdistance Du Bois, for Garvey was a self-made man, and Du Bois most unfortunately ridiculed Garvey's Liberty Hall while praising other Black occupied, but unlike Liberty Hall, white owned buildings. Garvey was quick to emphasize the flaw in his adversary's agreement by saying, "This shows the character of the man. He has absolutely no respect and regard for independent Negro effort, but that which is supported by white charity and philanthropy. And why so? Because he himself was educated by charity and kept by philanthropy." Father Divine, too, was judged by the yardstick of self-reliance. While refraining on one occasion from an outright attack, he was careful to emphasize that his information was secondhand and that he had no reason to know the inaccuracies of the lying propaganda against race leaders. He expressed concern over the white support, which was reputed to be propping up this new Harlem phenomenon. But the leader who, together with Du Bois, was the recipient of the severest attacks on this score was Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia. Much of Garvey's political efforts in England during the last years of his life were taken up with the question of the invasion of that country in 1935 by the Italian fascists under Mussolini, whom Garvey poetically characterized as the Italian dog, which line was duly made to rhyme with another calling him a violent hog. Garvey frequently bemoaned the circumstance that Haile Selassie had prayed and trusted God, while Mussolini, even though his fascist hordes had been blessed by the Pope for good measure, preferred to place his emphasis on modern technology and thorough training. There can be no doubt that Garvey's criticisms of the race were harsh and uncompromising, but this was a harshness born of love. For Garvey, the genocide practiced against the Indians in North America and elsewhere in the hemisphere, as well as the disappearance of African populations in South American countries, were of the race where the race had formerly been numerous, were indications of what would happen to African populations in the United States and elsewhere should they be lulled for too long into complacency. There was only one method of self-preservation. According to Garvey, the Negro must make his own material life. The weeping, sobbing, pining, cringing Negro must ultimately die. If he doesn't kill himself, his environment will kill him. Following the Darwinism theory of survival of the fittest, every creature that is too puny, too weak, too imbecilic must ultimately go down before the superior species, even though the creature be man. This is why, too, he sometimes preferred the cold reality of the Ku Klux Klan, though it would be wrong to call him a Klansman, as his enemies did, or to suggest that he condoned any atrocities perpetuated by this group, to the smooth flattery of would-be liberals. For the Klan at least might force Black people into a realization of the real dangers which face them. In any case, if white people felt like asserting their authority over their environment, they could hardly be blamed for this. I am not criticizing the white people. In fact, I am criticizing the Black man. I am a queer critic, but I am a logical one. Garvey obviously was about the business of building a Black nation, and as such, he was a firm believer in the primacy of race over other considerations making for cohesiveness. The Ethiopian, he reasoned, cannot change his skin, and we shall not. His thesis was that the universally oppressed African people of the world would have their primary objective to emancipate themselves as a race. And this would only be feasible in terms of a program built upon racial solidarity. While Garvey did not completely dismiss the progressive elements of other races, he had little patience with arrogant races of alien races who pretended to have the interests of African people at heart while persecuting their leaders. In his last Liberty Hall speech before his incarceration in the Tombs prison, he expressed amusement at the fact that his persecutor, the district attorney, said that he was more interested in Negroes than Marcus Garvey. Garvey was incredulous. It is a lie for any Jew to say he is more interested in themselves than Negroes are in themselves. It is an unnatural lie to talk about one race being more interested in another race than that race is interested in itself. For Garvey, a race, and particularly an oppressed race, was more than just a race. It was a political unit. These were his words. It was largely for this reason, and not for any of the ridiculous reasons advanced by some commentators, that Garvey hated the divisiveness introduced into the race by some elements among those of lighter hue, the Light Brigade. It was no case, as he had been alleged, of simplistic transference of attitudes developed in the West Indies to an alien context where the objective situation was different. Instead, Garvey saw in color cast manifestations, such as the Blue Vein Society, a trend which, if left unchecked, would culminate in the pronounced aristocracy of light skin which existed in the islands and which undeniably was present in the United States, though in his opinion to a lesser degree. Garvey justifiably claimed a portion of the credit for the appearance in the 1920s of the so-called New Negro, new, that is, in his resolve to retaliate massively against the lynchers and oppressors of the race. In the field of artistic endeavor, the New Negro is remembered for what has been dubbed the Harlem Renaissance. This so-called Renaissance witnessed an efflorescence of literacy and other artistic work with no real parallel before the late 1960s. But Garvey, possibly alone among important leaders of the race in that period, was able, because of his deep racial pride, to identify a nagging contradiction in the literary outpourings of the Renaissance. He expressed his concern in a Negro World editorial of 1928 by saying, "Our race, within recent years, has developed a new group of writers who have been prostituting their intelligence under the direction of the white man to bring out and show up the worst of our traits, the worst traits of our people." The immediate cause of this editorial was Claude McKay's Home to Harlem, which Garvey described as a damnable libel against the Negro. The 1930s found Garvey once more dissenting minority on a similar subject. This time it was Paul Robeson who incurred his displeasure for acting in productions such as Emperor Jones, Sanders of the River, Stevedore, and others, which showed the black man as a savage or a laughable idiot. For Garvey, it was not sufficient for the black artist to succeed in the white man's world. He had to go beyond that and place his artistic ability at the disposal of the struggling race, a struggling race which could not afford the luxury of its most acclaimed representatives being used to reinforce negative stereotypes inflicted upon the race. Garvey therefore believed in the primary race as the focal point of liberation of Black people. But to say this is to leave much unsaid. For Garvey, despite his firm commitment to a struggle in racial terms, seems to have largely avoided the reactionary pitfalls of cultural nationalism and negritude. We can hardly imagine Garvey saying, like the poet of negritude, hurrah for those who have never invented anything. And we could scarcely conceive of Garvey reveling, like the latter day high priest of negritude, in the supposed superiority of the emotionalism of the so called Negro over the precise technology of the Anglo Saxons. Fanon calls this banal exoticism, and Garvey would have agreed. For Garvey, the black man must cast off his superstition, sentimentality, and emotionalism and become a realist in a world where men depend upon organized force and strength. Though Garvey kept up a running battle with the class doctrines of the communists, about which more anon, he, unlike some of the exoticists of negritude, had no illusions about the realities of class distinctions among Black people. Replying to an article written by Du Bois in the Century magazine, Garvey said, admitting that Marcus Garvey was born poor, he never encouraged a hatred for the people of his kind or class, but to the contrary, devoted his life to the improvement and higher development of that class within the race, which has been struggling under the disadvantage that Du Bois himself portrays in his article. Emphasis added from Tony Martin. Garvey's writings and speeches are full of similar sentiments. In the wider context of Black versus white America, his was a race struggle, but within the confines of the race, he was simultaneously engaged in a bitter class struggle. It must not be forgotten that his first recorded militant struggle was as the leader of a strike against the boss class of Jamaica, and far from inducing him in a distrust of working class organizations, as an American biographer asserts, this incident set the tone for his entire career. As late as 1930, after his deportation from the United States, we find him forming a workers' and laborers' association in Jamaica, and he was robbed of a victory at the polls for Jamaican Legislative Council only by the fact that the British imperialists still deprived the Black masses of the vote under the guise of property qualifications legislation. Garvey's enemies were well aware of his threat to entrenched privilege, even within race. Amy Jacques Garvey quoted his Black opponent in the 1930s elections to the Jamaican Legislative Council by saying, apropos of Garvey's demand for minimum wage legislation and the 8-hour workday, could the smaller people who had to employ labor send such an impossible man to council? The same fear of Garvey's arousal of the Black masses can be seen through the warped reasonings of the 8 traitors of the race who organized the Garvey Must Go campaign that resulted in his deportation. In their letter to the Attorney General of the United States, they claimed that the UNIA was extremely dangerous since it naturally attracts an even lower type of cranks, crooks, and racial bigots, among whom suggestively to violent crime is much greater. The letter also characterized Garvey's followers as the most primitive and ignorant element of West Indian and American Negroes. Charles S. Johnson, in an editorial in Opportunity magazine, expressed a similar uneasiness at the phenomenon of the Black workers' presence and lumpen proletariats on the move. He spoke inanely of those dark, dumb masses to whom he has offered an opiate for their helplessness, a fantastic world beyond the cold grasp of logic and reason. Greetings, Sister Ra. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you and the elders for listening with you. And for his complete dedication to the Black masses, Garvey was repaid by a loyalty which astounded friend and foe alike. The very shareholders he was supposed to have defrauded in an indictment in the United States government and their alleged solicitousness after the welfare of Black people were the ones who in 1923 raised $15,000 bail money in cash, who subscribed enough money to launch a new steamship company while the case involving the Black Star Line was pending an appeal, and who finally paid the costs of the appeal. And in 1926, with Garvey in jail, 150 of his followers turned out in Harlem to parade behind his portrait in ceremonial robes. The Black man was as ready in those days as he will ever be. Queen Mother Moore even recalls an occasion in Louisiana when Garvey's followers forced the local police to let Garvey speak by dint of a massive display of armaments. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight? Despite the class basis of Garvey's movement, his relations with communists, black and white, were frequently stormy. His ideas on the subject of communism were complex and undoubtedly influenced by the particular communists with whom he came into contact. In the first place, he seems to have had a deep admiration for Lenin and Trotsky. This obviously did not necessarily mean an endorsement of all the principles of Marxism Leninism. There is no evidence that he made any deep study of these doctrines anyhow. His wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, in her biography, suggested that his admiration for Lenin was based on the fact that Nikolai Lenin, as a leader of the masses of Russia, deserved respect for what, in all sincerity, he tried to do for them. Said he, the masses need peace, bread, liberty, and land. These were clearly the same things which Garvey was fighting for. Garvey was also on record as suggesting that communism was all right for Russia, though not necessarily for other areas. Yet he was not unmindful of the similarity of aims between the revolutionary movements among oppressed white people and his own movement. In the front page editorial of the Negro World, he even suggested that the Black masses could learn from white revolutionary movements by saying, the royal and privileged classes of idlers who used to tyrannize and oppress the humble hordes of mankind are now experiencing difficulty in holding their control over the sentiment of the people. The Negro has been a slave to the white man's ideas for 300 years, and the hour has now struck for him to imitate the masses of white society and cut away from royalty and privilege. His admiration for Lenin and Trotsky was matched by the fact that his denunciations of communism frequently included some such qualifications as taught in America. And certainly his experiences with communism in America were not calculated to encourage his confidence in the movement. Some, such as the prominent Harlem radical W.A. Domingo, had been former members of the UNIA who were expelled on doctrinal grounds. Many other less well-known Black communists were infiltrated into the organization, and communist organs such as the Daily Worker made no secret of their ambition to convert the Garvey movement to the path of joint action between Black and white toilers under the leadership of a communist organization. Another element in Garvey's attitude to American communism was a very real fear of repression. This fear was sometimes repeated by leader writers and columnists in the Negro world, a fact which seems to have been forgotten by analysts of Garvey's movement, is that the years between Garvey's arrival in the United States, 1916, and his incarceration in 1925 witnessed a savage repression of white communists and other radicals which has no parallel outside of the McCarthy era. It was this period that the revolutionary industrial workers of the world were bludgeoned into ineffectiveness by a combination of wholesale arrests, deportations, pitched battles, sometimes resembling civil war and other means. This was also the period of the notorious Palmer raids when communists were rounded up by the thousands. The question which therefore recurred in the Garveyite circles was this: if to be Black meant to be lynched and exploited, and to be communist meant to be ruthlessly suppressed and deported, then what would be the fate of a large movement that was both Black and avowedly communist? And would the white radicals remain steadfast when, as would inevitably happen, Black revolutionaries were called upon to bear the brunt of official repression? Garvey also seriously doubted whether white workers in America and Europe were ready to forego their racial privilege for class interests on any large scale. He argued, like Lenin, that white workers enjoyed a relatively favorable condition at the expense of oppressed Black toilers all over the world. These same workers, pointed out, comprised the lynching parties and armies of repression which spread devastation in African communities at home and abroad. Stalin's rapprochement with imperialism in the 1930s encouraged him in his viewpoint that communism might be perverted by white opportunism. Many Black communists, notably George Padmore, broke with Moscow, though not always with Marxism in this period. Nevertheless, communist attempts to infiltrate and capture Garvey's movement must be seen as a tacit acknowledgement of the success of Garveyism, and the meteoric rise of Garveyism did not fail to teach a few lessons to these rival claimants for the allegiance of Black workers and peasants. So that by 1928, at the urging of Stalin, Lenin's thesis on the right of self-determination for national minorities was officially accepted as applicable to the Afro-American, and thereafter the demand for a separate Black state became official Communist Party policy. Shortly afterwards, the demand for a redeemed Africa was seen to make its way into the demands of the American Negro Labor Congress, a violently anti-Garvey organization closely aligned to the Moscow Line, despite occasional disclaimers to the contrary in their organizational press, because they're propagandists, remember? One of the most eloquent tributes to Garvey and his movement came in an official statement of the Workers' Communist Party of America shortly after his imprisonment in 1925. This statement demanded his unconditional release without deportation, as well as the unhampered furthering of links between Afro-America and Africa. It read in part, "The workers for the Communist Party, composed of Negro workers as well as white workers, and standing for the solidarity and emancipation of the working class on terms of equality of all races, cannot stand idly by while the capitalist dictatorship attempts to destroy a mass organization of the exploited Negro people. End quote. The communist Robert Minor had noted a year earlier that the lickety splits of capitalism in Washington do not love Marcus Garvey. This alone ought to make anyone of the working class think twice before condemning the man. The central idea in Garvey's philosophy was the idea of nationhood, the building of a strong, independent Black nation which would take its rightful place in the comedy of nations. Nationhood entailed, first of all, changing the self image of the Black man. All of the activities of the Universal Negro Improvement Association were designed ultimately to serve this purpose, and this was the expensive business. In the words of Amy Jacques Garvey in Negro World, nation building is our program, not building apartment houses or churches. That's too small of a job for us. Nationhood inevitably involved the Garvey slogan of Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. But the exact significance which Africa occupied in the thought of Garvey is the subject of controversy. Garvey's utterances on the subject were ambiguous enough to lead many to conclude that he advocated a wholesale return of New World Africans and particularly Afro Americans to the motherland. But two people who were in a better position to know them most, which were Amy Jacques Garvey and Bishop George Alexander McGuire, head of the African Orthodox Church, both explained that Garvey never intended anything more than a select colonization by pioneering people. Whatever the scale of migration, Garvey's idea was never to neglect the New World for the continent, for an important element in his desire to make Africa strong was the fact that a strong man is everywhere, so a strong Africa would necessity redound to the good of New World Africans. This argument was resuscitated by Malcolm X and given practical expression in the linkages he established with the Organization of African Unity. It is still enjoying currency among our own generation of Pan Africanists. Garvey's belief in the necessity to fight for political gains in America and elsewhere was given expression in the Universal Political Union, which sought to use the UNIA votes to the greatest advantage. He commended he even commended the example of Afro Americans to Africans elsewhere by saying, "The American white man has established his system of politics around self. The sensible Negroes, therefore, have realized that it is only by playing the white man's politics in America as he plays it can they get anything out of it. And so they are playing it with a vengeance, and we compliment them." Marcus Garvey loved Black people. He sacrificed his health, his money, his family life, and his liberty for the cause of Black people. He is said to have wept after witnessing the sadly depleted ranks of Black veterans marching down Lenox Avenue after World War I. The thought that these men without a land to call their own, called upon to make the supreme sacrifice in a cause which was not theirs, and the reward for which would often be a lynching while still in uniform, was too much for him. So Garvey wept. But like all Black leaders of any importance in the struggle for human dignity, Marcus Garvey could not bring himself to emulate the blind hatred of his oppressors of his race. Said he, "The Negro isn't going to revenge anybody. He has never murdered anybody in bed, although the white man has taught him all these vicious and wicked things. It is the white man who is going to injure himself. He is about destroying himself by his system of injustice, not only to others, but to the different groups of his own race. And that is the end of our reading for tonight. I will be back tomorrow to read the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. But did anyone have anything they wish to add to what Marcus Garvey had to say, Tony Martin had to say about Marcus Garvey? Because I think that it's interesting that Marcus Garvey continued to have a public face that said we need to replace and remove ourselves, but we don't need to hate these people. I think that it's interesting that we had these whole tenets of we shouldn't hate these people and we can't respond to them with the same hate that they respond to us with. I think we need to rethink that because I'm more of an eye for an eye type person, and I may not hate you because hate only hurts my heart, but I definitely know how to get away from you and how to not deal with you, how to not care about you, how to move on from you. So thanks for tuning in. I want to thank Bwana Haguziki, Brother Bakari, The Forecast, Sister Raw, Afro Native, Tinkerbell 87, and Jesse's Kids for donating and contributing to this reading. I'd like to thank Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, The Forecast Radio, Sister Raw, Anthony McPhail, and KW Don 7 for coming in tonight. I appreciate each and every one of you. I value your opinions and your thoughts. Leave me a comment about the reading if you get a chance. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Peace. Yay.